Good evening. If you're watching this before bed, let's talk about something that matters more than most people realize. What you eat in the hours before sleep and what it actually does and doesn't do for your brain. I want to be upfront with you about something. There's a whole genre of videos out there that promise a single food will reverse a decade of brain aging or restore your memory in weeks, usually attached to a made-up doctor, invented patients with suspiciously perfect before and after stories, and statistics that sound impressively precise but don't trace back to any real study. That kind of content preys on something real: the fear of losing your memory, your independence, the ability to recognize the people you love, and it turns that fear into a sales pitch. That's not what this is. Real nutrition science on brain aging is genuinely encouraging. It just happens to be more modest, more honest, and, I'd argue, more useful than the miracle cure version because it's the version you can actually trust and build a habit around. So tonight, 5 foods, backed by research I can point you to by name, with the real numbers attached, and just as importantly, the real limits of what those numbers show. No invented doctors, no fictional patients, no numbers pulled from thin air. Why the evening actually matters. Let's start with the underlying idea, because it's worth understanding rather than just accepting. Sleep isn't downtime for your brain, it's some of the busiest housekeeping your brain does all day. During deep sleep, your brain runs a waste clearance process, sometimes called the glymphatic system, that helps flush out metabolic byproducts that accumulate in brain tissue while you're awake and thinking. Sleep is also when a large share of memory consolidation happens, the process of taking the day's scattered experiences and filing them into more durable, longer-term storage, the way a librarian might spend the night reshelving books that piled up during the day. Given that, it's not unreasonable to think that what's circulating in your bloodstream as you drift off, your blood sugar, your amino acid levels, your inflammatory markers, could have some influence on how smoothly that overnight process runs. That's the honest, biologically plausible version of the golden window idea you may have heard elsewhere. It's not magic, and it's not a guarantee. It's a reasonable hypothesis that lines up with some real research, which is exactly the kind of claim worth taking seriously without taking it too far. With that groundwork laid, here are 5 foods with real evidence behind them, ranked from solid supporting evidence to the strongest evidence we currently have. Number 5. Blueberries. Blueberries are rich in anthocyanins, the deep blue-purple pigments responsible for their color, and these compounds are genuinely among the more studied plant compounds in brain aging research. They're small enough to cross the blood-brain barrier, and in animal studies they've been shown to reduce markers of oxidative stress and inflammation in brain tissue. In humans, the picture is encouraging but more modest than headlines often suggest. Some controlled trials in older adults have found improvements in specific memory measures after several weeks of regular blueberry intake, typically wild blueberry powder or juice equivalent to roughly a cup of berries a day. The honest caveats: these trials tend to be small, sometimes a few dozen participants. The improvements are measurable but modest rather than dramatic. And a slightly better score on a memory test is not the same claim as reverses memory loss or repairs your brain overnight. Still, blueberries are inexpensive, essentially risk-free for almost everyone, fit easily into an evening snack, and have real trial data, however preliminary, behind them. That combination earns them a place on this list. A half cup, fresh or frozen, is a perfectly reasonable serving. There's no strong evidence that a specific hour before bed matters more than simply eating them regularly as part of your week. Number 4. Greek yogurt. Greek yogurt earns its spot for a more down-to-earth reason than exotic brain chemistry. Protein needs actually go up, not down, as you age. And most older adults don't eat enough of it. Here's why that matters. Researchers describe a phenomenon called anabolic resistance. As we age, our bodies become less efficient at taking dietary protein and actually using it to maintain muscle and tissue, including the ongoing repair of neural structures. This means older adults typically need more protein per meal than younger adults to get the same maintenance benefit, not less. Getting adequate protein, spread across the day and evening, is a genuinely well-supported strategy in aging research, tied to preserved muscle mass, mobility, and general resilience, all of which matter for overall brain health indirectly, since cardiovascular and metabolic health are closely linked to cognitive health. Greek yogurt specifically contains casein, a slow-digesting protein that releases amino acids gradually over several hours, which is part of why it's often recommended as an evening protein source. It can supply the body through the night rather than in one quick burst. As for the tryptophan to serotonin to melatonin pathway you may have heard about, that biochemistry is real. Tryptophan genuinely is a building block for serotonin, which the body can convert into melatonin. But the actual effect of eating a serving of yogurt on your measured melatonin levels is small, and Greek yogurt isn't a particularly concentrated tryptophan source compared to foods like turkey, eggs, or pumpkin seeds. So think of this one honestly as a reasonable, protein-rich bedtime snack that supports an aging body's real nutritional needs, not a natural sleep drug. 1 cup of plain, full-fat, or low-fat Greek yogurt with no added sugar is a solid evening choice. Number 3, walnuts. Walnuts are the only tree nut that contains a meaningful amount of a plant-based omega-3 fatty acid called ALA, alongside a range of polyphenols with antioxidant properties. On paper, that profile makes them a strong candidate for brain support, and for years that's exactly how they've been marketed. Here's where I want to slow down because this is a genuinely good example of why the specific type of study matters enormously. Some cross-sectional studies, meaning they compare different people at a single point in time, have found that older adults who regularly eat walnuts score higher on cognitive tests than those who don't. That sounds compelling, but it's the kind of finding that can also be explained by other factors. People who eat walnuts regularly may also, on average, have healthier diets and lifestyles overall, more education, or better access to nutritious food, any of which could independently support cognitive scores. The more revealing studies are the ones that follow the same people over time. A large 4-year study using health and retirement study data, tracking over 3,600 adults aged 65 and up, found that walnut eaters did have higher cognitive scores than non-eaters at every time point measured. But critically, walnut consumption was not associated with a slower rate of decline over those 4 years. In other words, walnut eaters started out ahead, but their trajectory over time wasn't measurably different. The most rigorous evidence we have comes from the WAHA study, Walnuts and Healthy Aging, a genuine 2-year randomized controlled trial, one of the few of its kind testing a single whole food against cognition in around 640 older adults across 2 countries. The top-line result, walnuts had little measurable effect on cognitive decline in the group as a whole, but showed a more promising effect specifically among participants who already had higher risk factors, such as smokers or those with lower baseline scores. That's a real, useful, nuanced finding, and it's a far more honest picture than "walnuts turn the light back on," because it tells you walnuts aren't a universal fix, but they may matter more for people already at elevated risk. A small daily handful, roughly an ounce, about a dozen halves, is a reasonable, low-cost habit with a genuinely strong overall nutritional profile, even where the memory rescue framing oversells the human evidence. Number 2, raw honey. I want to be especially direct about this one because it's the food on this list where marketing has run furthest ahead of the science. You may have heard that raw honey promotes neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells, through a flavonoid compound, and that it raises levels of BDNF, a protein involved in neuron growth and repair. Those specific mechanisms have mostly been demonstrated in animal studies and lab research, not in robust human clinical trials. That doesn't mean the underlying biology is entirely made up. Early-stage research often does start in animals. But it does mean that claims like grows new brain cells in the hippocampus are running well ahead of what's actually been shown in people, and presenting them as settled fact isn't honest. What raw honey does have going for it is more modest but still genuinely useful. As a natural sweetener, it has a somewhat lower glycemic impact than refined white sugar for a given amount of sweetness, and there is reasonable general evidence that more stable overnight blood sugar supports better sleep quality, and sleep quality itself is one of the better established levers for cognitive health over time. So if you enjoy a spoonful of raw honey stirred into warm tea before bed, there's no strong reason to avoid it, and it's a perfectly pleasant part of a wind-down routine. Just hold the framing honestly. It's a reasonable sweetener choice, not a treatment for memory loss. Number 1, fatty fish. This is the food on tonight's list with by far the strongest human evidence, and it deserves the top spot honestly, not dramatically. Researchers at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago have tracked thousands of older adults over multiple long-running studies, some following participants for 6 years or more. Across this body of work, people who ate fish at least once a week showed roughly a 10 to 13% slower rate of cognitive decline compared to those who rarely ate fish. A difference the researchers estimated was roughly equivalent to being 3 to 4 years younger cognitively by the end of the study period. That's a real, published, peer-reviewed finding, not an invented statistic, and it's been broadly consistent across several of their studies over the years. Zooming out further, a 2017 systematic review and meta-analysis pooling data from 9 separate studies and over 28,000 people found that higher fish consumption was associated with roughly a 20% lower risk of Alzheimer's-type dementia when comparing the highest and lowest intake groups. Fatty fish is also a central pillar of the MIND diet, short for Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay, developed by Rush researchers by combining elements of the Mediterranean and DASH diet specifically for brain health. The MIND diet emphasizes leafy greens, berries, nuts, beans, olive oil, and at least one weekly serving of fish, and it has been associated in multiple studies with slower cognitive decline, and, in some analyses, fewer brain changes associated with Alzheimer's pathology. Why fish specifically, biologically speaking? Fatty fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel are the richest dietary source of preformed DHA and EPA, the omega-3 fatty acids that are structural components of neuron membranes, not just a helpful nutrient, but literally part of the physical architecture of brain cells. As we age, the body becomes less efficient at converting plant-based omega-3s, like the ALA in walnuts and flaxseed, into the DHA the brain actually uses, which is part of why a direct dietary source of DHA becomes more valuable later in life. This is genuinely one of the better supported dietary patterns in aging research, not because of one dramatic headline number, but because the signal shows up consistently across multiple long-term studies, different research teams, and different ways of measuring cognitive outcomes. A modest, simply prepared serving, baked or steamed rather than fried, 2 or 3 times a week is well within the range these studies actually looked at. The honest bottom line: there's no food on this list or on any list that will single-handedly restore your memory even after 90 in one bedtime bite. That's not how the biology of a decades-long condition like cognitive decline works, and anyone telling you otherwise is asking you to trust a story instead of the evidence. What the actual research does support is something less dramatic, but genuinely more encouraging once you sit with it. A consistent, plant-forward, fish-inclusive dietary pattern, maintained not for one night but across years, is associated with meaningfully slower cognitive decline in some of the largest and longest-running studies we have on aging in the brain. That's real, good news. It just isn't a secret, and it was never going to be sold to you in a single spoonful. If you're noticing real persistent changes in your own memory or thinking, not just an occasional misplaced set of keys, but a pattern that concerns you or the people around you, the most useful next step isn't a supplement or a specific evening snack. It's an honest conversation with your doctor, because memory changes can have many different causes, and a number of them are very treatable when caught early. Take care of yourself tonight, and if this was useful, share it with someone who'd rather hear the honest version.